07 Star Citizens, hope you're all having an absolutely fantastic day. We have a special one today. We have the Post-Mortem for Alpha 3.18 and 3.19 being released by CIG. Now, some of you may be asking what is a Post-Mortem. Essentially what they're doing is they're looking at how those two patches went with all of the features, all of the player feedback they got, and they say what went well, what went bad. So we're going to have a read of it, but don't worry, I'm not going to be going word by word throughout the entire document. Make sure you check it out yourself, especially in case I miss anything while I'm going through it in the description below. And if you have any comments or opinions about this Post-Mortem, chances are myself and Salty Mike are going to be talking about it on ATC this week. So make sure you come hang out over at twitch.tv/SaltyMike at 4 p.m. UTC on Sunday, and then you can call into the show and talk to us what you think about it. But let's get into it. Firstly, 3.18 and 3.19 are the only major patches that have released so far this year, with 3.18 bringing along with it, of course, persistent entity streaming, and very possibly one of the worst patch releases in Star Citizen history. At the very least, since I began in 2019. So let's start with 3.18. What did CIG learn? As many of our players experienced, we launched Alpha 3.18 on March 10th of this year. The biggest headliner of the patch was our delivery of persistent entity streaming, which completely rewrote how we save state in the game and ushered in the beginning of the promise of a truly persistent universe. PES is one of those bits of text that we've been hearing about for the last couple of years, and we finally had the opportunity to play with it. And for the most part, when we were in the PTU, it started working pretty well, and it did promise to bring a lot of those things that they've been talking about. And then when it released to live, everything broke. If you were not there for the release of 3.18, so many issues. First off, we had tons of people had their entire accounts bricked. They were not able to actually log into the game for weeks after the patch released. For those that were able to get within the patch in the first couple of days, you were pretty much not able to do anything. ASOP terminals weren't working. You weren't able to call the ATC. Ship despawning, way too many things in certain locations due to PES. It was a mess. And they actually tell us a little bit about why that may have been. When the moment of truth came and Alpha 3.18 shipped to live, the shocker to the system was beyond what we had projected. While it's true that we expected PES to create a rough experience initially as we ironed out the issues that could only expose themselves at massive scale, to say that we were surprised by the depth of chaos from the PES launch would be an understatement. When the patch first dropped on March 10th, we experienced our highest peaks ever for logins per minute and per hour, and had our highest number of attempted logins in a day for the first few days of launch. This is a little surprising. We had gotten a couple of numbers last year about, what their average daily users were over the course of the year, and it was quite large. I think that peaked one day at 50,000 people playing in the same day. To find out that they had the most attempted logins of all time when PES was released does bring a little bit of that into context. The sheer overloading of the servers when you weren't expecting it. It just sort of makes those first few days of, the bad launch make a lot more sense. I was hearing people who didn't play Star Citizen at all talk about the release of 3.18 as a, stepping stone to actually get into the game. And we had a sort of interesting instance where around that time, there weren't massive releases, at least for PC gaming. So there was a lot of people just kind of looking for something new to do. All of that, as well as with what CIG are saying now, makes a lot of this make sense. We underestimated the multiplicative forces of going to live and now creating and persisting every entity players created through their actions, creating a load on our service that was beyond our initial forecasts. And that sort of makes sense with what was happening in PTU. The PTU patches were pretty damn stable. And we had been theorizing that a lot of this was likely due to the fact that they just weren't able to truly stress test PES. We've been talking about for the last couple of months that there, should be more incentives for people to play in the PTU so they can stress test these with people. But there is a section later on that we'll get to talking about that hopefully will help them do this in the future without making 10,000 people play PTU. We learned a lot from the launch of PES, and while we are still recovering and regret the compromised service in the first days and weeks of the rollout, it has definitely taught us a valuable lesson to value and preserve the integrity of the service more than we had in the past. That's why as we begin to roll out the replication layer split and crash recovery, two things now enabled by PES, we will do so gradually And as we begin to deliver server meshing, we will create dedicated testing channels to harden those new technologies further and implement standards and thresholds before we graduate them to PTU and then live. Server meshing is obviously a huge talking point this year, as PES was a really large roadblock in order for us to get there. It is good to know that they are going to take server meshing with a little bit more care in this essence, where it is a gradual release, so that we don't have what happened in 3.18, a patch that was potentially going to be the most fun patch of all time with a terrible launch. So let's get into a bit more of the specifics of 3.18. Also, they do talk about things that aren't just PES, so we will get to those at the moment, but this is the biggest thing of this year, obviously. So what did go well with persistent entity streaming? Well, apparently, at least in terms of how the strike team performed behind the scenes, that went really well, which is always good to hear. Communication was rampant, and they were able to maintain a very high quality for the strike team. The initial testing of PES went fantastically in the PTU. However, they do mention that, as you'll see soon, that did lead to some issues. And the architecture did prove that it will tend towards recovery. Essentially, that means it works, able to recover from even the worst kind of problems. What didn't go well? The research and development aspects of PES posed challenges, requiring the engineers to invent ways around unforeseen problems. Due to the foundational nature of PES, integrating it into the Star Citizen game code resulted in significant changes that disrupted the game at a very low level. Issues by the changes introduced by PES only became apparent during large-scale use and under heavy player load, which caused delays in identifying and resolving the problems. This is exactly what we were seeing. Pretty much because there were so many people going into live in 3.18, everything stopped working, and PES was the issue. We underestimated the multiplication factor between the PTU and live operations. The group had estimated a 10 times increase in backend activity, but were faced with a 20 times plus increasing requests, stream message sizes, and overall activity, which caused service outages across the board during the initial launch. Now, there's a couple of other things in here that they say didn't go well for PES that I think you should definitely read, as they are relevant, but it's not necessarily stuff that we ourselves felt. It's essentially that PES worked, but it broke a lot of things, and those things required a lot of time to fix, because it just could not deal with the sheer amount of people that you get at a live environment. Now, luckily, as part of this post-mortem, with all of these features that we're going to be talking about, they also do a what we'll do better / future plans, which I love. Thank you, CIG, for letting us know, hey, here's what went well, here's what went bad, here's how we're going to improve the situation. Going forward, we'll finalize and use the new cloud test launcher to adequately stress test the game shards at scale. This tool will simulate player behaviors and allow QA and the engineers to connect multiple modified game clients to the shard. This is something they've actually showed us before, and it was really interesting to hear them talk about, we're going to be using that for PES, for server meshing, that sort of thing. It's stuff that we need tested before we go into a live environment, even into a PTU environment. Obviously, we're probably not going to see the results of these extremely soon, but the fact that they have that capability now should mean that we essentially don't get a repeat of the 3.18 launch. Hopefully. The team responsible for PES has now moved on to static server meshing and are embracing a transformation approach to the new project. Unlike PES, this foundational technology can be integrated into the code base gradually, avoiding a disruptive big bang approach. Parts of the server meshing tech are already available to the game team for testing compatibility with their game features. Combined with the cloud test launcher, this approach aims to facilitate a smoother integration process for static server meshing. That's, I believe, the first confirmation that we've had on them working on static server meshing. Two things about that. One, that to me sounds like there's largely not a lot more work that needs to go into PES. I would assume bug testing is still a part of that, but in terms of large parts of the feature, they're done. Now moving on to server meshing, this makes me think we're still probably not going to see static server meshing by the end of the year. PES took a really long time for them to work out, and when they did work it out, it took a couple of months still before they were able to get it to work with live. I feel like server meshing is going to be the same way. They did mention server meshing will be integrated gradually, and so won't have as many issues, but I think that sort of just once again speaks to this is going to be another long process. I'm hoping that it's not too long, as we mentioned, PES was the major roadblock to server meshing. I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. We do have a roadmap roundup coming up tomorrow that may be able to speak on this sort of things, but I'm not incredibly optimistic about that. Am still generally glad that they're working on it though. That's the big one. Pretty much all of the other features in 3.18 and 3.19 are minor features, ships, that sort of thing, and I'm kind of curious what CIG think of. So next, we're going to talk about a couple of environmental things that got brought into 3.18 and what CIG are going to be doing in the future. So let's start talking about rivers. The inclusion of rivers marked a significant milestone in our quest to create more realistic and immersive planets. We were quite happy with the improvements to river canyons we were able to achieve between 3.18 and 3.19 due to improvements in our asset pipeline. I think the rivers are fantastic. They're a really, really awesome feature. I just think I would like to see a little bit more variations in them, maybe different watercolors. Maybe there's more to it than just, you know, single river goes into a large lake, you know, actual river systems. But in general, I think they did a really good job with rivers, as they didn't really have many devs on it. It was mostly one dev working on it for the past 2 years. And then, you know, lighting and asset teams and stuff helped along there. But it was very, very small amount of people. What didn't go well? The procedural river placement tool was not in as good of a state as we had hoped when we started using it. As a consequence, a considerable amount of manual effort was required to meticulously place and verify the resulting rivers to ensure their optimal quality. This is a little disappointing. We saw the river tool a lot last year and the year before, I believe. And it gave us a lot of hope for increased speed at creating environments, because they were just able to, at the click of a button, create really as many rivers as they want. So hopefully they continue working on that tool, because, you know, it does sound like a tool that will make this significantly faster. The numerous issues that were successfully identified and addressed during this initial run of rivers have already made a significant impact towards ensuring a smoother experience for next time. Next up, we have the sand caves, which are pretty much a complete reimagining of how caves work in Star Citizen. And they did mention that along with these in the future, we're probably going to see ice caves, rock caves, you know, weird different variations. We were very happy with the results of this initial push to develop an improved pipeline to produce individual rooms for all cave archetypes, and also define the visual identity of our sand caves. With neither the tools for procedurally assembling locations nor automatically placing them on planets ready for use, we had to build and place every cave manually. So very similar to the rivers issue, it sounds. I think the sand caves themselves are quite fun. It's just there's not really a reason to go there yet. There's no sand cave missions yet. All you really go there is to mine some janelite and get some bugs. They look fantastic, but as a lot of the time in Star Citizen, things that look fantastic don't necessarily mean there's things to do there other than take pretty pictures. Hopefully that changes soon. They go on to mention that we are going to be getting one of those new variations quite soon with the new rock caves. They also want to give us bigger connections, new rooms, entrances, all that sort of stuff. Make them feel a lot more unique. One that was very close to my heart was the PTV racetrack, the BTR PTV racetrack on Orison. This was something I was extremely excited for, as I do a lot of ground racing in the community. And it was amazing and terrible. So let's start with, it was created very quickly. We went into it with the idea that it was a simple location with a short time frame and minimal impact on other teams. We have since seen organized races on the track. We also got code support for upgrades to the respawning vehicle entity, so if people were to crash, break, or abandon the PTV, it would respawn back at the starting area of the track. One thing that isn't mentioned in this before we go over to these next sections is that the PTV itself is in such a bad state that it's practically impossible to get more than maybe 3 laps done on the track. And that's pretty lucky. The PTV just breaks down at every single turn that it has. Once again, it is kind of a thing where, like, the track itself is awesome, but I wish they chose a different vehicle to use, or they buffed up like the wheels on the PTV or something. They do mention that they actually had initially planned for this to be released in 3.17, which I do vaguely remember. It feels like a very, very long time ago. But it still had to be QA passed and get bugs fixed, so that's why it ended up being in 3.18. They do mention that in the future, they want to make more tracks like this, and one is actually in progress. However, they're on the back burner. That makes sense. I don't think there's necessarily a need to have 20 of these different racetracks out in the field right now, but it will be nice once they come up. Just please either fix the PTV or put a different vehicle on there. One of the most fun aspects of 3.18 was the revamp of security post-Korea, essentially turning it into a mini jump town. What went well? We could never have imagined the level of support we received from the art team, which really rejuvenated the location. And you can tell. The amount of Crusader iconography that's strewn throughout the entire mission, plus all of the new Crusader armor sets that were made for this revamp were fantastic. And they really give you a sense that this is a place where you do not want to be if you're a criminal. This is a proper security post. The player-triggered sandbox activity was well received, and analytics showed that hacking crime stats at Korea is still very popular, which was a concern for us as we were taking a risk removing the other hacking locations. That was, I've got to say, one of the biggest complaints that I had heard from the community is removing all these other places that you could potentially hack away your crime stat. I haven't heard anyone complain about that since 3.18. I wonder, and you can tell me in the comments below, do you miss that? Is that an issue for you? I had predicted that it likely wasn't going to be an issue for the vast majority of players, and it seems to be that that is the case. So let me know in the comments if I am wrong. The mission still has rough edges that need ironing out. Also, additional analytics needs on sandbox activities were identified to be able to further understand player participation. They go on to say that they're going to be continuing looking sandbox activity. These locations and these missions are becoming more popular and they're becoming more detailed because they are, in essence, what Star Citizen will look like in an end game state, if that makes sense. SPK, as it stands, the gameplay of that I don't think will ever change. I don't think the gameplay of the Ghost Hollow mission will ever change, at least in terms of how this new brand of PvP works. Speaking of PvP, Jumptown had a rework in 3.18. Now, this was a pretty simple rework. All they essentially did was like copy the building and put it back to back and connected. They did a lot of work on the outside to give it a bit more of an atmospheric vibe, and it works pretty well. I think every single time that I've played Jumptown over the course of the last couple of months, I've had a fantastic time. The double entrances are great. Only issues I've been having have been with invisible players, not the mission or the location itself. So understandably, it was very, very well received. However, the implementation of PES led to performance issues around the location after a lot of ships were destroyed. We also wanted to redrop the locations with Rastar. However, we were unable to at the time due to it breaking the shops. That's another interesting one. So it means that we're probably going to see what we've just seen in 320 with them replacing all of these stations with Rastar. The same thing is going to be happening to Jumptown. Essentially, no different to us, but big for the back end. The interesting part, for the next run of global events, we're planning to redrop the locations on different planets to give different gameplay. For example, in thick atmosphere, higher gravity planets, and forests. Jumptown on a Microtech forest would actually be possibly my favorite dynamic event of all time. That's got me extremely excited. The racing content and time trial modes were well received by the racing community, helped by the content teams who produced many more tracks than we could have hoped for. I can back this up just by saying I've never seen so many people actually try out racing before, now that it is an in-game mechanic. What didn't go well was poor server performance meant that a sophisticated new system of checkpoint tracking had to be created, though the markers still do not update as responsively as we would like. Also, an interesting, very, very small one, analytics show that relatively few players unlock the second track. I think that is because the racing community is so small. Feature itself was done amazingly, but it's just not one that a lot of people want to do. Couple of very small ones. We had the addition of the infiltrate missions on Orison, essentially bunker missions, but on the Orison platforms. In general, they were well received. However, they did have to turn it off for 3.19 because they were going to do Siege of Orison again, but everything broke. Then we had the new prison activities, which definitely did give a facelift to the entire prison gameplay, which sorely needed it. Firstly, they updated the prison escape mission, which everyone was very, very happy with. Inside the prison, loot on the AI and new selling terminals were well received. Players felt the new AI made the prison feel more alive, and it gave them another way to earn merits. Essentially, way more prisoners actually in the prison section, which, you know, it's always fun to, instead of you mining yourself, you just knock out a bunch of prisoners, take their gems, and hand those in to reduce your sentence. What didn't go well is it's incredibly buggy. If you've tried to do this in the last 6 months, it's very inconsistent when you're actually able to escape from prison. So their future plans are to fix those bugs. Next up, we have 2 ships, the Vulture and the Antares. Now, the Vulture was a really big undertaking for CIG, especially as it came along with it the salvage patch itself. They did mention that they were able to actually add a couple of extra features into it, which is presumably the crafting mechanic that you can do on the boxes when you do, you know, salvage some loot. However, there were obviously a lot of complaints about the actual moving around the ship. As you know, if you've actually been in a Vulture, you have to constantly be getting out of your seat, moving a box, going back, refilling, get out of your seat, move a box, and you have to do like 20 times in order to get a full cargo hold, which is just bad gameplay, unfortunately. Releasing vehicles alongside their gameplay loops rather than earlier in the project, like the Starfare and the Claimer, is something we've been striving to do in recent times and will continue aiming to do this. I do think that is a reason why the Vulture was so well received in general, even with the issues that it has, is that it came with gameplay. So good to hear that is still a thing they're trying to do. Now, during the release of the Scorpius Antares, obviously it wasn't particularly well received by the players because the co-pilot essentially doesn't really do much, and CIG do admit that that is a problem. With master modes and new MFDs coming in the future, we should see the co-pilot get more gameplay features rather than being half passenger, half button presser. Now, the last two major things is salvage itself. The entire salvage gameplay loop in terms of the cargo that you can get, as well as hull scraping. Other than PES, it was certainly the big player feature of 318. So there's one major thing that I want to point out here. The scope of the work for salvage was drastically underestimated, as we thought the existing UV2 damage system all ships used would be suitable out of the box. However, we very quickly realized we'd have to do an entire pass on every ship to up the quality, as you were looking at the visuals much closer than the damage system. In addition, a lot of features and systems hull scraping was relying on were still in active development when we were building the core gameplay system. This meant the feature was handed off to the EUPU team with a fairly compressed timeline for release. Essentially, they released it kind of early. They wanted there to be a lot more work done, especially in terms of having more ships be salvageable. I'm very excited to see what happens with hull scraping and salvage going ahead. And you know, there were some updates in 319 and 320 that are more of that. CIG have really started to get into the frame of let's just continue working on the features that we've released recently, rather than here is a big but badly optimized feature, and the next patch is another big but badly optimized feature. So that's 318. I know that that's a lot, but this is going to be a long video. Let's get into 319. So we were just talking about salvage. In 319, we got the addition of salvage contracts. These were contracts that you could take that would essentially send you to a place where you can salvage a ship. You have salvage rights to that ship. We're very proud of what we achieved. Initially, we had only expected to release with hull scraping, but we're able to get cargo and the brand new detachable components feature included. However, we didn't choose the best ships for the mission, as only some have detachable internal components and gold standard hulls for scraping. And due to developer illness, the first release saw a very rough pass of cargo spawning, meaning there was no time to properly balance or verify that all items can be sold. I think they did a better job than they're actually giving themselves credit for in this. Yes, there were some issues with these contracts themselves, but in general, it's exactly what I expect from these types of contracts. Something that's been a huge problem in Star Citizen ever since we were first able to walk on planets has been the new player experience. People rock up into the game and there's no tutorial, and they just kind of sit there asking in global chat, how do I get to my spaceport? I'm currently sitting in the middle of Hurston. Well, 319 did deliver us with the new player experience, or at least a version of the new player experience, where we can now say, hey, if you're a new player to the game, here is 30 minutes of the game teaching you everything you need to know baseline to play. We received a lot of positive feedback from new players. The new player experience has helped them learn the game. I have also been hearing that from a lot of new players. I can now actually say when someone comes into my stream, hey, how to play game. Any YouTube videos you recommend? I can also say, yeah, but remember, there's a tutorial for 30 minutes. Make sure you pay attention. What didn't go well was that the mission is largely modular, but not entirely so, which means more work is needed to bring it to the other locations. We didn't have sufficient time or support to teach the player inventory management or interacting with shops. Inventory and shopping is a huge part of, most video games at this stage. So not having the time to put that into the new player experience on initial release was a bit of a letdown. In terms of the production itself, new player experience was a cross-team initiative and as such was complicated to coordinate. Production support for new player experience changed a few times as it wasn't owned by a dedicated team. That to me just essentially says, yeah, this wasn't essentially managed correctly, and I very much appreciate when CIG say stuff like, yeah, these features weren't communicated properly within the different teams, or, it was worked on awkwardly or complicated, because it gives us, a bit more insight to any time there's a feature that may be a little bit buggy. As expected, they're going to be trying to bring this to the other locations, which is yeah, it's expected. Next up, we have the vehicles in 319, starting with the RSI Lynx, the very, very long-awaited vehicle. The Lynx started off as a very simplistic adjustment of the Ursa, but as we progressed, we felt it deserved more. So it ended up with virtually all new geometry and materials, which paid off as the vehicle now looks the part and sits well with the Constellation Phoenix. It's a cool car, yeah, whatever. All this additional work obviously meant that it took additional time for them to complete the vehicle, but in general, they're very satisfied with it. The Fury and the Fury MX. Despite its size, the Fury series is one of the most complex vehicles we've ever put in the game. They've actually been telling us this over the course of probably the last year or so, where, you know, there was a vehicle that they were producing that had very weird thrustering mechanics and they had to solve a lot of problems. I think in general, the reason that they did the Fury, other than it being an onboarding task for a new dev, is because they wanted to make sure they could do what they needed with the Fury so that they can do it with the Santok Yai and any other future vehicles that do have unique maneuvering thrusters. It is good to know that it was delivered ahead of schedule, which anytime that happens with a vehicle is fantastic news because we all know how many vehicles are behind schedule. Some of the tech we needed for the thruster rotations took a few attempts to iron out, and we accidentally caused other issues with thrusters on other ships, but all was solved before release. Next up, we've got a feature that felt very small, but actually had a huge impact to the state of Star Citizen, which was the item attach detach. This is also sort of a little bit part of salvage, but a massive, massive deal. Finally, players are able to loot vehicles for components and weapons, greatly expanding the salvage gameplay loop. This was such a game changer for Star Citizen that I now often don't buy weapons anymore. I will pretty much just try to always loot, you know, my Panther repeaters, my Rhinos, whatever it is, off ships that I've killed. It's one of those things where it was such a late addition to the patch that I keep forgetting that it came out. It just feels second nature now. And finally, one of the biggest things in 319, probably the reason some of you are watching me right now, is the 319 mining balance. As someone who mines in Star Citizen, this was the biggest change to the game in the last 3 years. They were actually trying to make mining fun again, despite what some of you will say in the comments. The community reception has been fantastic, and we're very happy with how the release panned out. Long-standing metas and balance issues have been resolved, and mining is now a much more nuanced gameplay loop that allows for multiple strategies. Now, it is important to mention that 320 has taken some of the issues from the mining rebalance that happened in 319 and fixed those as well. Essentially, this is an ongoing work that they're doing right now. They do explain that there were a lot of bugs with the mining rebalance, which there 100% were. One thing that they don't really mention is that their initial attempt to create a situation where there was no meta for mining didn't quite work. There was still a meta where everyone should be running this exact laser with these modules, get maximum green zone. It's the best way to do it. That has been fixed in 320 so far. We want to continue to improve our communication around mining with the community and keep listening to critical feedback to make mining the best it can be. We'll also put more trust in the data we gather to help inform future design decisions around mining gameplay. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your 318-319 post-mortem. I know I said that I wasn't just going to read off the thing over and over again. I hope that we had a little bit of a conversation there. If there's anything from the post-mortem that you want to talk about it, make sure to post it in the comments below. We'll have a little bit of a conversation. There's some things in here that are very interesting. One thing that I think is really important, it comes down to us truly committing to preserving the experience for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who now play Star Citizen as a live service game, albeit an alpha still in development. That's right. It is a live service game. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching the video. Make sure to like it. If you did like the video, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more Star Citizen stuff, and hit the notification bell to be notified every single time I release a video. As I mentioned earlier in the video, we do have the roadmap roundup coming up tomorrow, and if it's got some big stuff, we're going to be talking about it here on the YouTube channel, so don't miss that one as well. 318, 319, they were a very rough half of this year, but it sounds like CIG have learned a lot from it. See you guys in the verse.